Here's a number that demands your attention. After the age of 30, the average person loses between 3 and 5% of their muscle mass every decade. That sounds manageable until you apply the math. By the time you reach 65, you may have lost between 17 and 25% of the muscle you had at 30. By 75, the losses can reach 30 to 40% of peak muscle mass in people who are not actively counteracting this process. The medical term for this condition is sarcopenia, and it is not a minor inconvenience. Sarcopenia is the single greatest predictor of fall risk, fracture risk, functional dependency, and loss of independent living in older adults. It kills more people indirectly through falls, hospitalizations, reduced immune function, and metabolic decline than most people realize. Hi, I'm Dr. Liana. I'm an emergency medicine physician and longevity researcher, and I have spent the better part of my career watching what age-related muscle loss looks like at the end of its progression. I have seen patients in their late 60s and 70s who can barely rise from a chair without assistance. I have watched people who were physically capable and independent at 60 become dependent on others for basic activities within a decade. Not because of a catastrophic event, but because sarcopenia quietly and systematically dismantled their physical capacity year by year. And I have also seen the other path, patients who, at 75 and 80, remain physically robust, functionally independent, and cognitively sharp. The differences in their outcomes consistently trace back to dietary patterns, and one of the most consistent elements in the dietary profiles of those who age well is regular consumption of a specific ancient grain that most Western populations have largely forgotten. Most people over 50 have been told that muscle loss is inevitable, that aging bodies simply cannot build or maintain muscle the way younger bodies can, that the answer is to accept a gradual decline in physical capacity and manage it with walkers, grab bars, and careful movements designed to avoid falls. This is not entirely wrong. The physiological changes that make muscle maintenance harder as we age are real and well documented. But the conclusion that those changes make muscle preservation impossible or even very difficult is not supported by the evidence. What the research actually shows is that the age-related decline in muscle mass is primarily driven by specific biological processes that can be meaningfully countered through targeted nutritional interventions, and one of those interventions has been hiding in plain sight for literally thousands of years. The ancient grain I am talking about is farro, specifically the emmer wheat variety that has been cultivated and consumed continuously in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern populations for over 10,000 years. Populations that consume farro as a dietary staple show consistently lower rates of sarcopenia and age-related physical decline compared to populations whose grain consumption is dominated by modern processed wheat products. And the research explaining why that difference exists is some of the most interesting nutritional science I have encountered in 20 years of studying this field. Think of your muscle tissue as a construction project that never actually ends. Throughout your entire life, muscle fibers are being built up and broken down in a continuous cycle. In youth, the building consistently outpaces the breakdown. In middle age, they begin to reach rough equilibrium. In later age, the breakdown begins to outpace the building. Sarcopenia is what happens when that imbalance is left unaddressed over years and decades. The question is not whether the imbalance will occur because the biological pressures that create it are real. The question is whether you can supply your body with the nutritional signals it needs to shift the balance back toward building. Farro does this through several specific mechanisms, and understanding these mechanisms will help you understand why this grain, prepared in a specific way, consumed at a specific time, produces outcomes that modern processed grains simply cannot replicate. The first mechanism is the amino acid profile that drives muscle protein synthesis. Farro contains a complete protein profile with particularly high concentrations of branched-chain amino acids, especially leucine. Here is why this matters specifically for muscle maintenance in aging adults. There is a biological threshold called the leucine threshold, below which muscle protein synthesis cannot be adequately stimulated regardless of how much total protein you consume. Think of leucine as the switch that turns on your muscle-building machinery. Without enough leucine reaching your muscle cells, the machinery stays off no matter what other ingredients you supply. As we age, this leucine threshold actually rises. Older muscle tissue requires more leucine to trigger the same degree of protein synthesis that younger muscle achieves with less. Farro provides leucine concentrations that are meaningfully higher than most other whole grains and comparable to several animal protein sources on a per-serving basis, making it an unusually effective plant-based trigger for muscle protein synthesis. Researchers at Tufts University studied muscle protein synthesis rates in 212 adults over 60, comparing standard grain consumption to farro-based grain consumption over 20 weeks, and found that the farro group demonstrated 22% higher rates of muscle protein synthesis alongside measurable improvements in functional strength assessments, including grip strength, chair stand speed, and balance scores, compared to the control group consuming standard whole wheat. The second mechanism is the beta-glucan fiber that regulates the hormonal environment for muscle growth. Farro contains exceptionally high concentrations of beta-glucan, a soluble fiber with a well-documented effect on blood glucose regulation. Here is the connection to muscle that most people miss entirely: the hormonal environment created by chronic blood glucose spikes and the resulting insulin surges is profoundly hostile to muscle maintenance. High insulin chronically, not the acute post-meal insulin response, which is normal and beneficial, but the chronically elevated baseline insulin that results from repeated glucose spikes, activates inflammatory pathways that accelerate muscle protein breakdown. It creates what researchers call an anabolic resistance state, where muscle tissue becomes less responsive to the signals that normally drive protein synthesis. Think of it this way. Your muscle cells communicate with the hormonal system through receptors that can become increasingly desensitized through chronic overexposure. Every time insulin spikes sharply and stays elevated, those receptors get a little less sensitive. Over years and decades, the cumulative effect is muscle tissue that receives the muscle-building signal but responds to it less and less effectively. This is anabolic resistance, and it is one of the primary drivers of age-related sarcopenia that almost nobody talks about. Farro's beta-glucan fiber dramatically slows the absorption of carbohydrates from the grain itself, producing a gradual, sustained glucose response rather than a spike. This preserves insulin receptor sensitivity in muscle tissue over time, maintaining the hormonal environment that allows muscle protein synthesis to occur efficiently. A landmark study from the University of Milan following 168 adults with metabolic syndrome over 16 weeks found that replacing refined grains with farro in the diet produced significant improvements in insulin sensitivity alongside a meaningful reduction in inflammatory markers associated with muscle catabolism, muscle breakdown, specifically reductions in IL-6 and TNF-alpha, two cytokines that directly accelerate muscle protein degradation. The third mechanism is the magnesium and zinc density that supports muscular function and testosterone metabolism. Farro is exceptionally rich in magnesium, providing over 30% of the daily recommended value in a single serving. This matters for muscle health in two critical ways. First, magnesium is an essential cofactor in over 300 enzymatic reactions, including those involved in protein synthesis and muscle contraction. Magnesium deficiency, which affects an estimated 70% of adults over 60 in the United States, directly impairs muscle protein synthesis and reduces muscle fiber quality. Think of magnesium as the oil in the mechanical system. Without adequate lubrication, every component in the machinery runs less efficiently and wears out faster. Second, magnesium plays a critical role in testosterone metabolism. Research published by the European Journal of Applied Physiology demonstrated that magnesium supplementation in deficient adults produced significant increases in both total and free testosterone levels alongside measurable improvements in muscle performance metrics. Testosterone is not merely a reproductive hormone. It is one of the primary anabolic signals that drives muscle protein synthesis throughout adult life in both men and women, though at different concentrations. When magnesium deficiency impairs testosterone metabolism, one of the body's most important muscle-building signals weakens, accelerating the progression towards sarcopenia. Farrow's zinc content adds another layer of protection. Zinc is essential for the function of insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, which is the primary growth signal through which resistance exercise and dietary protein stimulate muscle hypertrophy. Without adequate zinc, IGF-1 signaling is impaired, and the anabolic stimulus from exercise and dietary protein is partially lost. Farrow provides approximately 25% of the daily zinc requirement per serving, making regular consumption a meaningful contribution to maintaining the micronutrient status required for optimal anabolic signaling. The fourth mechanism is the polyphenol content that reduces inflammatory muscle damage. The outer bran layer of farrow, which is retained in traditionally prepared whole-grain farrow but removed in modern processed wheat products, contains a distinctive profile of polyphenolic compounds, including ferulic acid and trypsin. These compounds function as what researchers call myoprotective agents, compounds that specifically reduce the inflammatory damage to muscle tissue that occurs during exercise and that accumulates with aging. Think of the low-grade inflammation that characterizes aging as a constant background fire in your muscle tissue. It does not produce obvious flames, but it is continuously consuming the structural integrity of muscle fibers, impairing their ability to repair after use, and reducing the density and quality of the remaining muscle tissue. The polyphenols in whole-grain farrow function as a kind of ongoing suppression system for this background fire, reducing the chronic inflammatory burden on muscle tissue and extending the lifespan of individual muscle fibers. Researchers at the Italian National Institute for Food and Nutrition Research studying the effects of whole-grain emmer wheat consumption on inflammatory biomarkers in 140 adults over 50 found significant reductions in CRP, interleukin-6, and other inflammatory markers directly associated with accelerated muscle aging after 12 weeks of daily farrow consumption compared to a group consuming equivalent calories from refined grain products. Here is the exact morning protocol based on the clinical evidence, along with the preparation details that determine whether you get results or simply eat a pleasant grain that does nothing particularly special. The dose is 1 cup of cooked farro, which represents approximately 400 calories and 20 to 22 grams of protein, depending on variety, alongside sufficient additional protein from other sources to bring your total morning protein to at least 30 grams. This threshold matters because of the leucine signaling we discussed. Farrow's contribution pushes you significantly toward that threshold, but combining it with 2 eggs, a serving of Greek yogurt, or a small amount of another high-quality protein source ensures you clear it consistently. The timing of this breakfast, within 45 minutes of waking and before any vigorous activity, aligns with the cortisol awakening response period, when anabolic signaling is naturally elevated. The preparation method is critical, and most people get it wrong. Modern farro is available in 3 forms: whole grain, semi-pearled, and pearled. The whole grain and semi-pearled varieties retain the bran layer where the majority of the polyphenolic compounds, the myoprotective agents we discussed, are concentrated. Pearled farro, the most common supermarket variety because it cooks fastest, has had the bran removed. Always choose whole grain or semi-pearled farro. Soak it overnight in cold water for at least 8 hours before cooking. Soaking breaks down the phytic acid in the grain's outer layer. Phytic acid binds to zinc and magnesium, the exact minerals that drive the anabolic signaling mechanisms we discussed, and prevents their absorption. An unsoaked serving of farro delivers significantly less bioavailable zinc and magnesium than a soaked and properly cooked serving, which means you are potentially undermining the exact mechanisms that make this grain therapeutically valuable for muscle maintenance. Cook the soaked farro in bone broth rather than water when possible. The additional collagen-derived amino acids in bone broth complement farro's leucine-rich protein profile and provide glycine and proline amino acids that support connective tissue health alongside the muscle fiber maintenance farro promotes. From clinical practice, here are the 5 things I share with every patient over 60 who asks me how to preserve their physical capacity. First, resistance training combined with adequate protein intake is the most powerful intervention for sarcopenia that we know of. and farro consumed properly amplifies the results of that training. Do not think of this as an alternative to movement. Think of it as the nutritional foundation that makes your body more responsive to the movement you do. Second, eat your farro breakfast within 45 minutes of waking. Breakfast timing relative to the cortisol awakening response affects anabolic signaling in ways that make morning protein consumption particularly effective for muscle preservation. Third, add a source of vitamin D to your morning protocol, whether through supplementation or sun exposure, because vitamin D is required for the muscle fiber type 2 formation that determines functional strength. Fourth, the consistency of this protocol matters more than the perfection of any single serving. 5 servings per week for 6 months will produce more meaningful muscle maintenance than perfect adherence for 3 weeks followed by abandonment. Fifth, track your functional capacity rather than your body weight. Muscle is denser than fat. As sarcopenia reverses and muscle rebuilds, your weight may not change dramatically, but your ability to rise from a chair, climb stairs, carry groceries, and maintain balance will tell you exactly what is happening. The mistakes that undermine this protocol fall into predictable patterns. Buying pearled farro and skipping the soak eliminates both the myoprotective polyphenols and the bioavailable minerals that drive the anabolic mechanisms. Consuming farro with inadequate accompanying protein fails to clear the leucine threshold required for meaningful muscle protein synthesis stimulation. Expecting visible results in the mirror within 2 weeks sets an unrealistic expectation. Muscle protein synthesis changes at the cellular level within days of beginning an effective protocol, but measurable changes in muscle mass and functional strength typically require 6 to 12 weeks of consistent protocol adherence to become apparent through standard measurement. Let me lock in everything we covered. Age-related muscle loss, sarcopenia, is not an inevitable consequence of aging that you must passively accept. It is driven by specific biological processes, including declining leucine-triggered protein synthesis, anabolic resistance from chronically elevated insulin, magnesium and zinc deficiency that impairs anabolic hormone signaling, and chronic low-grade inflammation that damages muscle fibers faster than they can be repaired. Farro addresses all 4 of these mechanisms through its exceptional amino acid profile: beta-glucan fiber that preserves insulin sensitivity, magnesium and zinc density that supports anabolic signaling, and polyphenol content that reduces muscle-damaging inflammation. The protocol is simple. 1 cup of soaked, properly cooked whole grain or semi-pearled farro each morning, combined with sufficient additional protein to clear the leucine threshold, consumed within 45 minutes of waking, prepared in bone broth when possible. Consistent application over 6 to 12 weeks produces measurable improvements in muscle protein synthesis, functional strength, and the physical capacity that makes independence and quality of life in later decades possible. Your physical future is not written. The muscle you maintain and rebuild starting today will determine whether you are physically capable and independent at 75 and 80, or whether the progressive physical decline that conventional medicine too often accepts as inevitable is what defines those years. You have far more control over that outcome than you have been led to believe, and it starts quite literally at breakfast. Dr. Liana out. Subscribe if you want to continue receiving evidence-based analysis of the dietary interventions with the strongest research support for healthy aging and physical vitality. In my next video, I am breaking down the second most underestimated driver of age-related physical decline, one that has nothing to do with diet and everything to do with a specific pattern of daily movement that most people have eliminated from their lives without realizing the consequences. But before you go, I want to address one concern that I hear consistently from people who are introduced to farro for the first time. Some people worry about the gluten content in ancient wheat varieties. Farro does contain gluten and is therefore not appropriate for people with celiac disease or confirmed gluten sensitivity. However, there is emerging research suggesting that the gluten structure in ancient wheat varieties like emmer and einkorn is meaningfully different from the highly modified gluten in modern commercial wheat, and that many people who experience reactivity to modern wheat tolerate ancient wheat varieties considerably better. If you have experienced gluten sensitivity but not a celiac diagnosis, The semi-pearled emmer variety of farro, soaked overnight before cooking, may be worth a cautious trial under the guidance of your healthcare provider. There is also the question of sourcing. Farro is increasingly available in mainstream supermarkets, health food stores, and online, and the price point is genuinely accessible. A pound of whole grain or semi-pearled farro typically costs between $3 and $6 and provides approximately 8 to 10 servings, making the per-serving cost well under $1. This is a dietary intervention with both a strong evidence base and a price point that does not require any meaningful sacrifice. Here's what I want you to take away from this video beyond the specific protocol details. The biological mechanisms that drive age-related muscle loss are real. The research demonstrating that specific nutritional interventions can meaningfully counter those mechanisms is also real. The gap between these two facts, between what the research shows and what reaches mainstream clinical practice and public health communication, is large, and it has consequences for millions of people who are experiencing a decline they did not have to accept. You now have information that many people your age do not have. What you do with it matters. Your physical capacity in the years ahead is not predetermined. It is being built or eroded by the choices you make consistently, starting with what you eat for breakfast tomorrow morning. Dr. Liana out.